Thanks. Hi. I'm going to talk more specifically about Shenzhen only, pretty much. This was really interesting to see this in this comparative perspective, both within southern China and internationally. Because Shenzhen is a kind of an unusual place in many respects, and I know you're all going there very shortly. And how many of you have already been there? No, almost. Two. I wasn't very enthusiastic. You've been there. Well, obviously you know where it is. But I think one of the key things for understanding the role and the morphology of the urban village in Shenzhen is particularly how they came to be, because it's not really the same typical story that we would find in other cities in China, largely because of the fact that Shenzhen was one of China's very first special economic zones, as you've probably already encountered, 1979, 1980, and it had the unusual distinction of being, as Stefan already pointed out, a fairly rural area with some market towns, with a total population of about 300,000 if you took all the villages into account. So relatively small, no one village was really all, town was really all that large. And then by decree, you had the creation of a city, which literally ended up being built around the villages. Now, one of the key issues here is that in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping is instituting reform and opening in China and trying to find ways to get China away from the Cultural Revolution era and increase its overall status and standard of living, he was, as we now all know, was particularly set upon trying to introduce market reforms. This was not necessarily something that was wildly popular among everybody in the Communist Party. So the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was not without some serious opposition from other parts of the party. And so it would have been a bit much to have gone into this area and simply destroyed all of the former collective farms that were most of the villages. So they came up with a kind of a funny compromise at the time, which they didn't think really was much of a big deal, which was that they left the villages under rural land law, and the rest of this space fell under urban law. Now, as Stefan has indicated, the rural-urban divide in China is one of its hallmarks and one of the most important aspects of understanding how urbanization happens, and indeed sort of the key to the entire society. And under rural land law, you have, let me just see if I have a similar image of the one that you had before, right? Under rural land law, there were certain privileges that were distinct from the city. For example, farmers were allowed to have more than one child. They weren't necessarily being held to the one-child policy because it was assumed that you needed more people to work on the farm. The villages were owned collectively, and the head of the village head was also the party secretary, and you could pass down the property, so to speak, from generation to generation within the village. Within cities, you were not allowed to own property, and to this day you have use rights. I'm assuming you're familiar with these kinds of things coming from urban planning, of 70 years of use rights. But you don't technically own your property. You're not entitled to pass it down from generation to generation. So when you had small villages like this happened to be, in fact, an oyster and fishing village, although most of them were farming villages, they became surrounded by urban space, but they themselves remained rural. And the government had expropriated most of the farmland to use to build new factories and new housing, but they left, they gave each farmer about 150 square meters of plot, of which 80 square meters was intended for a house, and the rest of that was intended for subsistence farming. The farmers quickly came to realize, despite a kind of utopian idea that they would be growing food for the workers in the factories, they quickly came to realize that there was not much livelihood to be made by doing subsistence farming. And they quickly found their loophole, which Stefan mentioned as well, which was to exploit the fact that they actually existed in a kind of a state of exception, a space of exception within an exceptional space, and therefore fell to a certain degree, or to a significant degree, outside of the local jurisdiction and the enforcement of the law. This is what that village looks like today. And what these farmers did was, this is the village inside of the way, this is the older part of the village. This would have been, it's not the same village, it would look different, but it would have been the equivalent of this part of the original village. Here, they realized that they had one huge comparative advantage, which was it was possible to live illegally in the villages. As Stefan has pointed out, it's very difficult to move from rural China into urban China unless you have permission, unless you have a job. Shenzhen, which was a project that in retrospect is explained as being very perfectly planned, in reality was largely chaotic and largely the result of a lot of competition among different factions, among different ministries. And so when they were trying to build the city, they really needed a lot more labor than they were technically legally entitled to import into the city. So whether it was for literally building the factories and the skyscrapers and the built environment, or whether it was for working in the factories, there was a huge demand for labor. And this labor, as laborers want to do, found ways into the city, even though technically they were not allowed in. To go back for a moment to the image of the city, this entire space is the city of Shenzhen. This red line is what's known as the second line. This was the border between the special economic zone and the rest of China. And this is the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. So the municipality of Shenzhen is larger than the special economic zone. Which is inside of here. And up until very recently, and you can still see the remnants of it, and presumably you will, when you go to Dafen, for example, you'll drive right through it. This was a border that you needed to stop and show your papers at this border. And it's been largely dismantled, although technically there's still some control, but it's usually looking for people who are coming in for sex trafficking or sex work and things like that, so it's a little more subtle and you probably wouldn't notice it. But this was a very real border. And right near Meilin, where you're going to be, is the border itself, because Meilin is right north of, right here is Meilin, and the border is right here. I once actually tried, a friend of mine was living in Meilin, wanted to take me on a hike along the border because there was a road for the military vehicles, which is now kind of a walking path. I think we turned some of it into a greenway, but at the time there was still a guard for the road leading up to it, and they wouldn't let me up there. So he told him, no, you can't go up there with him. So this line here was supposed to keep people out who weren't supposed to be in the zone. But of course, there were lots of ways to sneak into the zone, and many of those workers then found their way into the urban villages, because the landlords realized that if they built up to the envelope, they could make a lot of money renting out their space. So if they rented, let's say they had, let's say you have 8-story building, which is quite typical, with 3 to 4 apartments per floor. You rent them, and this was more than 15 years ago, $300 to $400 a month. A family could bring in $80,000 US dollars equivalent a year, which is a lot of money for a farming family. So the family that owned the plot would build up. They would initially have lived on the ground floor, and then they would have rented the spaces above. And as Stefan has indicated, the wealthier they got, the less inclined they are to continue to live there. So very often you have absentee landlords, many times they live in Hong Kong, or they live in some of the newer buildings that have gone up like this around them, and they continue to rent the spaces out to migrant workers. There's some other views of them. So what's really important about the villages in the history of Shenzhen is that A, it allowed for the labor that allowed Shenzhen to be built, and even more importantly, allowed Shenzhen to become the factory of the world, which for many years, it really was the leading source of exports. Pretty much almost anything that, any electronic item we have here has some component made in Shenzhen. Your iPhone, iPad, Foxconn is there, Huawei is there. And another thing which it did, which was incredibly important, is it allowed the city to basically not have to worry about finding housing for a large percentage of its population. So the urban villages are about 15% of the land, and they house about 50% of the population. And keeping in mind that these are not legal, for the most part, not legal dwellings. They're not up to code. They were done at a time when wherever you draw the border of the village was not technically part of the city, not subject to the city's jurisdiction. As Stefan pointed out, you might have 100 villagers, but you might have 150,000 people living in the village. This causes all kinds of problems for planners, because if you're planning based on 100 people living in a village and you're figuring out infrastructure or you're figuring out services, you're not planning for 150,000, you're planning for 100. And so these became spaces that allowed the city in some ways to offload its responsibility with a wink and a nod towards having to find a way to house the people that they needed as workers without having too much difficulty at the city level. These are, for example, phone numbers. If you're looking for an apartment, you can go in and you can call one of these numbers and you can find an apartment in one of the villages. So these are just some more images from the villages. Indeed, handshake buildings, also known as can't get a coffin in buildings. You can imagine that the local fire departments do not think very highly of these spaces. They are indeed complicated spaces when they flood or when there's fire, and for other obvious reasons. So the interesting thing is that, so two things. I'm trying to combine the story very quickly because I actually want to get to something more current, but this background is important to understand it looking backwards. So stop me or signal when you want me to try to wind down. The city was, for a long time, very uncertain about how to respond to these villages. On the one hand, the villages were extremely useful because they provided housing, and they also provided a space for a lot of services. If you wanted to get your clothes fixed, or shoes, or buy certain types of goods, or you wanted to get a massage, or you wanted to eat good food cheaply, you would go to the villages. So even if you weren't living in the village, you would go to the village. In addition, because housing is so scarce in Shenzhen, you also had a lot of white-collar people moving into the villages. So unlike many other informal settlements, this was an important point that Stefan made, there's actually quite a mix of social classes even within some of the villages, although not all of them living in necessarily this area, which is certainly the lower social class. So the city wasn't quite sure what to do with them. On the one hand, they disavowed them as dangerous and as a cancer on the city. On the other hand, they recognized that if they were to bulldoze them overnight, they would be stuck with millions of people that they would have to do something with. So in order to, they didn't want to provide, the municipal government doesn't want to have to provide the housing for millions and millions of people. They're much happier to have it worked out in various kinds of agreements with villages. So, so they went through this kind of cat and mouse game that went on for a long time, where the city would try to control the farmers because they were a little afraid of the autonomy that was arrogated to these enclaves. But the farmers would always find some way to get around the control. So they tried to limit the plot size, for example, right? They tried to limit the number of households per plot. And the farmers would find ways to create more households and therefore get more plots. They had cousins and family over in Hong Kong, so they would come back and register in Shenzhen, and then they would have another household and get another plot. They would limit the plot size, so they would reduce the plot size, and all that reducing the plot size did was that it meant higher density and higher vertical heights. So they would reduce the plot size, and the people would build higher. They tried to stop all approvals for any buildings because many of the buildings were illegal, but not all of them. So they tried to stop all approvals, and the result was simply that everybody kept building, and all buildings were technically illegal. So then they tried to give an amnesty to everybody because they realized that was untenable. And they said, well, if you pay a fine, we will then retroactively allow you to keep your building. But the fine was so low compared to the income that the villagers were making that they were very happy to pay the fine. So this kept going on, and so finally, and there were all kinds of other ways, examples, talked about in the paper. One of the most popular, of course, and we can talk about these in more length if it's of interest, is compensation, a very complicated issue, one of the most prominent ones. You often have people who resist compensation, as with this fellow inside of the way. This is now the site of King Key 100, the tallest building in Shenzhen. You will see it when you go there. So, but this is now a 100-story building. Compensation is complicated and didn't always work out either. They tried show of force, some crazy demolition that was turned into a media spectacle. This is in Yunnan village. But what really seems to be the approach of choice is co-optation. So this is Tianmian village right off of Futian district, and the villagers, the city, and developers struck a deal whereby the villagers would allow developers to build a 4-star hotel. They wanted it to be 5-star, but I don't know if they made it, and from which this picture is taken. Luxury condos, which are over here, and then middle-class housing that the villagers would then move into, and then in the background, which you can't see in this picture, unfortunately, renovated handshake buildings, which were wider streets, so fire engines could come in. They won an award for being a civilized urban village, but the key thing was that the villagers could continue to rent out the space and make income. So there was compromises reached in this sense, but what the city eventually did is they decided enough is enough, and they forcibly made all former farmers who had rural hukou, which is to say they didn't have urban hukou, they were rural citizens. They forcibly gave them the urban hukou and urbanized them, which meant that they technically lost the right to, say, pass down their property to different generations. They did get use rights. But despite that, they maintain an identity as villages with village gates and a very lively sense of village identity, which you will see, especially in Shanghai. Here's an example of one of the village gates. This is in Gangsha. But the fact that the villagers were given the urban hukou allowed the city of Shenzhen to say, which they proudly declared, that Shenzhen is the first city in China with no villages. This is not, this is a semantics, right? I mean, it is the first city in China that has urbanized all of the villagers, perhaps. And this was a scale model in the earlier urban planning museum, which is now gone. The urban planning museum is now 20 times the size of the old one, and this model is no longer there. But this model was there. There are no urban villages in this model. And there's a plaque which says, next to it, which says Shenzhen, first city in China with no urban villages. But what I'd like to try to talk about today is one slight variation on this. I'll see if I can do this in 10 minutes, is that good? Which is that the urban villages served a very important function for Shenzhen when it was booming. But Shenzhen is not exactly booming, although when you go there, it may seem like it's booming compared to many post-industrial cities in the United States. But the city itself has certainly faced a lot of challenges because it is, it's no longer as special as a special economic zone. The joining of China to the WTO meant that there were lots of rules which are now extended throughout the entire country, and so Shenzhen didn't have the upper hand. The return of Hong Kong meant that a lot of attention shifted to Hong Kong, that there were different legal regulations coming into play. Overall, the rising wages, the demand for higher pay in Shenzhen, combined with a lack of developable land, believe it or not, because a lot of Shenzhen is actually green space and wetland and not easily developable, meant that it costs more to manufacture in Shenzhen now than it ever did before. And as a result, a lot of the low-skilled assembly line manufacturers have moved inland, either a little bit to Dongguan or much further, or moved to Vietnam or moved to Bangladesh, especially in the textile industry and to some extent in the electronics industry. So it is a city that is experimenting with deindustrialization, as China is starting to experiment with deindustrialization in parts, even while it maintains a tremendous export capacity. And I was really surprised when I went, the last time I was there, last year, because when I was conducting research for the piece that maybe you read on Shenzhen in the late 2000s, 2007, 2009, essentially everybody spoke as if it was really a matter of time until the village's demise. That even those like Urbanus, who were really hoping that they could convince people of the merit of the sociality embedded in these spaces, were not overly optimistic that they would not meet the bulldozer's fate. In 2015, though, there are approximately 241, it depends on how you count, urban villages in Shenzhen. Only 20 centrally located ones were currently facing redevelopment. And even some of those plans were on hold, although you'll see that some of them are moving ahead in Baishuzhou, for example, and Gangsha. And even more to my surprise, people were saying things like, some government officials were referring to them at the villages as the future of Shenzhen. And when I asked why, because until fairly recently they were referred to as the embarrassing rural past of Shenzhen, which would rather not be acknowledged, to be disavowed and pretend it doesn't exist, to be urbanized, civilized as quickly as possible. Invariably, the answer as to why they're the future was some form of characterizing the village as a kind of maker space. That was a kind of a gray space that was important to the economy. I thought this was a bit odd, so I started looking around and realizing how present some of this discourse was, although it also had to do, at that time, the Maker Faire was being And so I became interested in understanding how two things are sort of being linked. So there were two kinds of bastard offspring, if you will, of the reform process, in the sense that they were the unintended consequences of reform and that were also at some level troublesome to the government. One of them is certainly the urban village. Because the urban village itself was not planned per se, it was more accidental in the sense that these were the holes left by the creation of Shenzhen, out of which then became these exceptional spaces that the villagers, understanding their unusual arbitrage ability, were able to use to build in the way that they did. The other is the whole industry of knockoffs, which Dafeng, as you pointed out, is a really interesting case, and there's a wonderful book by Winnie Wong called Van Gogh on Demand, if you want to read in great detail about the history of Dafeng. But Shanzai is the term I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Shanzai is a term that doesn't really, it's a literary reference, so it doesn't really translate directly. In English, it's often rendered as knockoff or fake. It really doesn't do justice to the term because there's a significant sense of playfulness and subversiveness in the term. And Shenzhen has become very famous as a location for Shanzai industry, which I'll talk about right now. But what I was interested in is how two sort of bastard offsprings of reform, Shanzai and urban villages, are now becoming acknowledged as sites of innovation and as a site of transvaluation. So the Maker Faire was an interesting experience, and maybe since we're short on time, we can talk a little bit more about makers in general, but in China, it's not an obvious fit due to its origins in a more of a sort of anti-consumerist, counterculture, DIY kind of space. But it became championed by the premier, Li Ka-ching, in visit to Shenzhen last January of a year ago. And partially because it received the stamp of approval from the central government, it exploded. And so you have this Maker Faire Shenzhen, where a giant poster proclaims, we are makers, don't wait, just make, Or the Faire's motto, I am a maker, is ubiquitous everywhere, right? You see it there, you see it on the minis, which are all over, you see people walking around with signs saying, this was I am a creator, there's a version of I am a maker, there's the Intel logo, what will you make? And then you get things like the maker becomes a kind of new kind of person, a sort of model citizen who can both redeem and advance the nation in a certain way. So you have this kind of rhetoric where you have, maker might fail, thinker doesn't even try. Thinker is myself, maker is connected, be a maker. And the counterpart to this, which is on the other side, and I didn't include this photograph, says, thinker listens to the head, maker listens to the heart. Thinker says no, maker says yes. So, and in between these two slogans was actually two little boys about 8 years old, and their father was taking pictures of them framed by tools and circuit boards, and behind them was a 3D printer that had the suggestive name Dream Maker Overlord Pro. So there's a whole lot of things going on here that's about shaping the socialist market subject that is a kind of a value coding terms, which we could also go into, but I'll skip a little bit of that analysis. But what is interesting is that unlike some of the other ways in which these the discourses of things like quality, like Suji, or civilization when Ming has been introduced, with making, there is this idea that there's agency in equality. It's not just a kind of lack. So Seed Studio here is one of the larger maker spaces in Shenzhen, and on their label, instead of saying made in China or created in China, they say innovate with China. So it's sort of an invitation in that sense. And so making looks for value precisely within marginal spaces and seeks to remake them in new ways. So here's where Shenzhen enters into this, because the Shenzhen electronics industry is an area where there is what is now considered to be a considerable amount of innovation. These are all cell phones with Faire and all kinds of other phones there. The Shenzhen cell phone industry bears a lot of similarities in some ways to maker culture. And it's not a negligible industry. I mean, as you mentioned, Shipai in Guangzhou is very involved in electronic components. Cell phones command, these kinds of cell phones command about 50% of the Chinese market, or Shenzhen cell phones, and they account for more than half of all phones shipped around the world. Hundreds of millions of units shipped to Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. And there's a kinship with the tinkering, hacking, open source platforms, and if there's anywhere in China where there's the equivalent of sort of Microsoft or Apple naked in the garage, it's Huachangde in Shenzhen, which is not per se an urban village, but it's an area which is the electronics district, kind of like Akihabara once was, if you know Tokyo. And it's this crazy, unique ecosystem where it takes 30 to 50 days for a group to from first encountering a new brand, to reverse engineer it, to make technical and market calculations about new features, about its feasibility, profit, prototype, contracting, manufacture, and delivery. So if we could take a a legitimate large company, I'm not quite sure what the right term there is, a year, 6 months to a year to bring a product to market, they can do this in a month. But Shenzhen suffers from a really big image problem, similar to the urban villages, and here's where I'll start bringing them together. Shenzhen is a term associated with all kinds of faking, including intellectual property, especially above all, but also the deadly alterations of milk powder. You'll notice when you cross over from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, or pay attention, because you might not notice unless you look around, that there are going to be announcements about milk powder. There's going to be tons of milk powder in all of the stores right at the border, and there are going to be signs that are telling you what the limit is on the amount of milk powder that you can take over the border. One of the reasons for this is that there was a very big scandal in China where milk powder was adulterated and children were poisoned. And so many families in Shenzhen refuse to buy any milk powder from mainland China, so they go across and they import it from Hong Kong. So Shenzhen has a very bad reputation, and so for the government to be able to try to see this maker culture as connected to Shenzhen and turn it into something positive requires a kind of sleight of hand, and a kind of a rebranding as an acceptable mode of innovation. Similarly, the villages are both a byproduct of reform, and they have a bad reputation. Right? So it was surprising, to hear them talked about as the future of Shenzhen, because they've talked about it before as a kind of a slum and kind of a cancer. So it was interesting, and I'll start to close with this. I walked into the office of one of the maker spaces, run by David Lee, who you might meet because he's everywhere. This is another makerspace in one of the villages. Maybe I can come back to that slide in a minute, because I walked into his office, and with Funa, who you were going to meet because she works with Future Plus and the Shenzhen Center of Design, they were going over maps of the urban villages, and she was mapping what kind of office, what kind of shop was where, because they were looking for the best place to put a Fab Lab. And David Lee was telling me that he sees urban villages as the solution to the decline of manufacturing. They are Fab Labs, he said, and they form a kind of unique Fab Lab ecosystems. But the way he put it, and he's a little bit of a maker evangelist, and he's a little utopian, but he said, the villages are Fab Labs, but they just don't know it yet. They have all the ingredients, he would explain. They've got labor, they have shops, they have designers, they have artists, they have engineers, and in fact, many of the people who work in design and architecture and all parts of the city's life do live in the villages, partially because the housing is cheaper, partially because it's the only place you can find housing, partially because it's a cooler place to live than in a tower in the park. You know, he says they have all these ingredients: labor, shops, designers, artists, engineers, all living cheek by jowl but not talking to each other. And instead of being taken for granted as just a space for labor, he's been arguing that there needs to be a change in the mindset to think of the village as a kind of a distributed laboratory at the center of Shenzhen's creativity. And that might be a bit much, but it's interesting to sort of see this kind of shift in the discourse to thinking about that. And for Li, the villages replicate a lot of the core attributes of Shanzai. They use existing infrastructure to do rapid prototyping. They consist of densely networked clusters that share all kinds of information and knowledge. They have a vernacular expertise. They can modify plans that come in from professionals. And above all, they're really fast. You want something done fast, you take it to the village, they can build it, they can design it, they can get it done for you. You go in on Friday, you have it on Monday. So his idea is that you can have all kinds of prototypes that can then be replicated at the city level or as a model for other cities. And in his and some of his colleagues' ideas, you would even find crowdsourcing ways of funding this, so you wouldn't be reliant on municipal funding, and you would come up with basically a kind of bottom-up smart city where citizens' ideas are sort of prototyped like jazz improvisations. So if Shanzai's cell phone industry is an example of what you can apply, what you can do if you apply the maker model to an industrial scale, Li seems to be saying that the bottom-up smart city is what can happen if you apply the maker model to urban villages. So the thing that I'll close with, though, is that Li might be, this was a Steve Jobs quote in Hua Chongbei. This is not what I'm closing. Is that Li might be utopian, but he's not entirely naive. So he admitted, at least in conversation, that making was indeed the best facade and it was safe for the government to promote because it keeps people too busy to have a political agenda. And what allows everybody to unite behind making, and this is where it's the creativity discourse, which is so important now to thinking about the urban villages, is part of this larger question, is that it's recognized increasingly that the margins is where creativity and innovation happens, and the challenge is keeping the margins marginal enough to be innovative, but not so marginal to be dangerous, either ideologically or as a built space. So in China, this is very tricky. So there's this idea that you want to sustain the energy, and if you seamlessly absorb the urban villages and Shanzai production into the system, you would effectively disable their very dynamism. And there was a big debate in the Shenzhen government between whether a culture should be commodified and then returned into some kind of product, or whether a culture should be thought of as the plus, which shows the same plus that's in Future Plus, as a kind of a supplement that makes everything else more valuable, and therefore it cannot be isolated or sold without losing its value. So you have these debates within the Shenzhen city government, which is quite interesting, quite sophisticated debates, capturing culture's value requires being comfortable with a level of ambiguity. And the urban villages are these spaces that are effectively marked as simultaneously margin and center. Right? That's what I think is really interesting about them. They're at the margin, but they're also thought of as the center for creativity. They're literally at the center of the city in many cases, because some of the villages were literally in the center, although many of them were also distributed around. So they're spaces that are both margin and center at the same time, even though most discourses will either try to talk about them only in one way or the other. And this is just an example of the Shanzai discourse, and I'll go ahead with this, which the David Li, I was told, originally wanted to call his makerspace Shanzai Open Innovation Lab, but because of the negative connotations of Shanzai, the city did not allow that, so he called it Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab, but in the English acronym, SZ can stand for Shanzai as much as it can for Shenzhen, so he maintained that, that sense. So it's very fitting in some way. So that's a little image of some of the things going on there. I'm happy to talk about any of this, so thank you very much for your attention.